Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is the time and place tag. Now, I was tagged by Becky over at Bleed and Reads just before she decided not to move forward with her channel, but I had already planned to film this and was actually very excited about the tag because I remember Rosie doing it some months ago, and her answers and everything that I've seen other people talk about for this tag have just been really interesting. So the tag itself does not have a set of questions for you to respond to. Instead, you select 10 books that remind you of a specific time and place in your life, and you tell that story. So this is just going to be a very chatty, kind of casual video, and why don't we just dive right in? Okay, so we're not going chronologically because that would make the most sense, and I just didn't feel like it. So the first book we're going to talk about is The Seal Woman by Enna Mikkelsen and Elsa Hennesen. And this is a book that I actually bought as a souvenir when I was in the Faroe Islands, which was my last trip internationally before the pandemic. So this was summer of 2019. And the Seal Woman is everywhere in the Faroe Islands. Like, my cab driver who picked me up from the airport to take me to my Airbnb, he told me about this legend unprompted. There is this like statue or monument on one of the islands that unfortunately I couldn't get to because it was a little bit of a hike. There are Seal Women statues in all the souvenir shops. There are books like this one there. And it just was pervasive, and I was so curious about this legend. Like, I would chat up individuals to just ask, had they heard the legend? Was this a legend that was told to kids still? I was doing like some serious like investigative reporting without the actual reporting, but I was just so intrigued because the story is of these seal women, which legend has it, they come ashore on a particular night and can shed their seal skins, and they are these gorgeous women who then at the end of the night put back their skins and go back into the ocean, except in the legend someone steals the seal pelt, and so one of these seal women can't return to the ocean. And I would argue it's a fairly dark story, which is why I was so curious as to whether children were still being told the story, because there's a revenge element to it, and it's dark in the same way that I would argue that the Grimm brothers can be dark. But yeah, I was just so fixated on this legend once I found out about it and once I was there. It's why I bought this book in one of the souvenir shops. The first part of it is actually this like illustrated section with the legend itself, and then once you get through the legend, it is this like explanation of the motifs and how this legend has been passed along, and just more of like a cultural analysis, which was why I really thought this book was particularly interesting. But yeah, this just brings me back to that trip and to me just being really curious about a culture and a legend and really like immersing myself in the stories of the land that I was in. And this is just like a beautiful souvenir now that I have, that maybe if I have kids when they're a little bit older, I would probably share with them. The next book is The Botticelli Secret by Marina Fiorato, and this book takes me back to Oklahoma in 2010. I had a good friend who lived in Midwest City in Oklahoma. Her husband was in the Air Force, and he had been deployed to the Middle East. And so I had decided to go spend like the first 2 weeks that she would be home alone with her to help her transition. But I just didn't want her to be alone, was the general idea of it. And so while we were there, we were gallivanting across Oklahoma, because I was on vacation, so she was kind of showing me the sights. And one of the sites that she ended up showing me was the local Target, which is where I picked this book up from, as you can see by the little sticker here. And it's just a reminder of that summer and those 2 weeks, because essentially the two of us were big readers, so we bought a bunch of books together. So in the evening, when she was feeling a bit quiet, missing her husband, and kind of just needed alone time or quiet time, we would both just sit and read together. So I remember just sitting there reading this. This was also at a time that I was very, very into Italian Renaissance historical fiction, and this was just like a lot of fun. The main character modeled for Botticelli, hence Botticelli Secret, but she was also a prostitute, and she ends up getting herself into a sticky situation when she steals an unfinished painting, and then people are willing to kill her for it, and her like sidekick slash partner in crime is this novice from a monastery, and just hijinks ensues. It was just a lot of fun. Historically accurate, it is not, but this was just one of those books that was like a very summer, almost like beachy type of read, and it takes me right back to those 2 weeks in Oklahoma. Like, nobody's business. But yeah, that's the story behind this one. Alright, guys. Next book is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, and boy does this take me back. It takes me back to a summer when I was like 13 or 14, and I devoured this book. I would argue that this is the first like really big book that I read that also taught me not to be scared of page counts, because not only was I able to finish this, and it's like 1,000 pages, but I finished it in a day. So from that point onward, I've never really been intimidated by long books, because I know that I can read them even if it takes me time to do it. In this case, it took me no time at all. It was the start of a love affair, because this was one of my favorite books for the longest time, and really the only reason that it's come out of contention is because there are problematic elements within it that make me a little bit uncomfortable. The depiction of rape, the sympathetic look at the KKK, the representation of the slaves in the book. It's something that I would like to revisit kind of in light of Me Too and Black Lives Matter, and see if it still holds the same sort of allure to me, because the epicness of this story is just like, wow. But the irony is, for years, I fought my mother tooth and nail on watching the movie, because I was just like, it's old. Like, it's really old. And then I watched it, and I was hooked. Like, I started watching all the classic movies, and then I read this book, and this became one of my favorite books. And, like, I bought the sequel that was written in the 90s, which is a total guilty pleasure and absolute trash, arguably, but I also bought, like, the books from Rhett Butler's perspective, and just everything. Like, I was in this fandom hardcore, but the actual experience of reading it is one that still lives with me. And if you don't know what Gone with the Wind is about, it is a Civil War romance story, essentially, where this Southern belle, Scarlett O'Hara, has her eyes set on, like, her plantation neighbor, Ashley Wilkes, and there is this kind of, like, rascal, Rhett Butler, who is pursuing Scarlett as she's pursuing Ashley, and this is all happening over the course of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, and it's a fun time. And it's a book that I've reread several times, although not recently. But yeah, the first experience of reading this book, never gonna forget it. The next book is, I think, the only nonfiction on this list, but it is The Tigers of Forli by Elizabeth Lev, and this is a biography on Caterina Sforza, who is this Italian Renaissance badass that took on all these powerful men and just became one of my first probably historical girl crushes. Like, she was beautiful, she was intelligent, she was very strategic and political, and she just, like, ruled. Like, she really was a phenomenal figure. And this book is one that I read around the same time that I was going through the Italian Renaissance historical fiction phase, because she got mentioned in a couple of the books. She'd also appeared in a couple, like, Italian Renaissance period dramas that I'd seen on TV, and had just always been a character that was really fascinating to me. So I went and found a biography on her, and I read it and was reading it with the intention of, at the time, writing a novel on her, because I saw her as a character within stories, but I hadn't seen a book that was about her life. And this was at a time when one of my ambitions was to be a published author. It's not something that I aspire to do now, because I just don't think I have the patience for it or the discipline for it, but at the time, this was the historical fiction novel that I was planning to write. It was just a really interesting time where I was testing the waters. I was branching out from the historical fiction that I had traditionally read, which was like Tudor England, and started to really explore historical fiction as a genre more broadly, and also started reading and exploring more nonfiction as well. So this was kind of like a gateway for me on a lot of fronts. The next book is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and this is actually the version that I annotated while I was in college. But the first time I read this, I was in high school, and I was reading it recreationally. Like, I hadn't been prompted by a class to do it. Jane Eyre is like the first classic that I read that I fell in love with, and it really, similar to the biography, was kind of like this gateway for me, because I remember reading this story and falling absolutely in love with it. This story of Jane Eyre, who goes to be a governess for this, like, Byronic Mr. Rochester, and his charge, and the, like, gothic things that transpire, and the romance between these two characters, and I just fell hook, line, and sinker for it. Like, I absolutely loved it, and at that time, I was, like, writing a lot of fiction myself, and really wanted to be a writer, as I've mentioned, and I was emulating Charlotte Bronte's writing style and the writing style of the classics that I was reading in my own writing. And I was really challenging myself in that way. But this is a story that, like, just opened up the entire classics world for me. And I would argue that it's largely why when I went to school, when I went to college, I decided to focus on 19th century literature, particularly Victorian literature. And this book, with its Gothic elements, helped to inspire my senior thesis, which was on Gothic elements in another work that you'll soon be hearing about. But it just really, really had an impact on me. And it's a book that I have read countless times, partly because I probably was assigned reading for it like 3 or 4 times while I was in college, but it's just a book that has stayed with me. It's still one of my favorite classics, although Shirley, I would argue, is a very, very close second, and depending on the day, these two kind of switch positions. But as far as being a really memorable book and a really sort of important point in my life, this book has been there time and time again. Alrighty. Next, we have Euphoria by Lily King. And this is an interesting one because I think it's probably yeah. I would say that this is the most recent read on this list. And I read this last summer during the pandemic. I want to say May or June. But essentially we were all locked down, so it wasn't like I was able to really leave the house or anything. And this was before I started my channel, but I was keeping myself busy by reading on the weekends. And this was probably one of the few books in my adult life that I have binge read and finished in a day. I used to do that far more often when I was a teenager, because I didn't have all these other like responsibilities and things that I needed to get done. It doesn't happen that often nowadays, even in light of the pandemic, but I devoured it and it was just phenomenal. Oh, how I ugly sobbed through this book. That ugly sobbed. It just reminds me of that particular moment where the world was going to hell, but I had been given the gift of time to just sit quietly and read. It is a beautiful, beautiful story. I think a lot of people have read this book at this point, but it's set in the 1930s and is inspired by Margaret Mead, and there are these individuals who are like anthropologists, and they're visiting these different villages on a river, and there's like a love triangle. And as I said, I ugly sobbed through this book. But yeah, it brings me back to that moment where, although I was terrified of everything that was happening, I was sad and scared, and it just felt hopeless. Like, I had a few hours of escape reading this book. So, next up, Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. Now, this is gonna be an interesting story. So, this takes me back to the summer before 10th grade, because this was assigned reading for my honors English course. And this would be the first Leo Tolstoy piece of writing I ever attempted. And it's a novella. It is like 100 pages, barely 100 pages. And I remember reading it that summer, and I hated it. I hated every minute of it, to the point that I knew that if I put the book down, I would never pick it up again, and so I wouldn't complete the reading assignment. Like, that is how much I disliked this story. And you're gonna ask me, but Brittany, you love Leo Tolstoy, so... Yeah, no. I did not love Leo Tolstoy. I blacked out from reading this book. Like, I couldn't tell you what it's about today. I would have to do like a Spark Notes of it, because this was not the book for me. But I remember reading it and finishing it and doing my assignment and being like, people call Leo Tolstoy one of the greatest writers ever. How could this be what he wrote? Because there's nothing about this that is engaging or interesting. Like, I'm not blown away. In fact, I'm the exact opposite. How is that possible? And because I disliked it so much, and because I kept asking myself this question and being like, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I'm, like, just not smart enough to read Leo Tolstoy, or something is going on. Whatever the case was, I said, no. I need to read something else by Leo Tolstoy, and I need to give him a second chance, because he needs to prove himself to me. Like, that's how I looked at it. I was like, this is crap. He needs to prove himself to me that he is worthy of all the praise that he receives. And that's when I picked up Anna Karenina and fell in love with Leo Tolstoy, because that story I was just like, oh, now I get it. But yeah, when I read this novella, I would have laughed in your face if you told me Leo Tolstoy would be one of my favorite authors of all time. I would have thought you were crazy to say that I would read both Anna Karenina and War and Peace when I was 15. Like, none of that should have happened after reading this, but it did. And it's all because I hated this so much, and I was like, Tolstoy, prove me wrong. So yeah, I just remember that one day in the summer that was hell, because I was forcing myself to read this little thing. And yeah. that's the story behind that one. The next book actually makes sense chronologically, and that's War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Now, as I mentioned just a second ago, I read Death of Ivan Ilyich and basically challenged Tolstoy to prove my opinion of him wrong, and he did. But this book is so ingrained in my head for a particular moment in time, because I read this when I was 15. This was like my school bus book read for months. So my high school actually was a 45 minute drive from where I lived. So I did a lot of reading on the bus in the morning and in the evening. And War and Peace was one of the books that I tried to read while basically commuting to school. And this book, which is like 1,500 pages, took me, it feels like years to read, but I think it was a couple of months, because it's a lot. Like, it was a brain workout, and even though I would read for nearly like an hour before school and an hour after school, I was getting through maybe like 20, 30, 40 pages at most at a time. I think I remember really being disheartened by the fact that, like, I spent an hour reading the book and would get through like 25 pages. Like, I remember that because I am a fast reader. And so when a book takes me a long time, it's very frustrating. Like, I always question myself, like, why is this happening? Why do I feel like I'm not getting anywhere with the book? And that could have made me stop reading this book, because I was just so discouraged by the process. But I persisted. I kept, like, picking at it and just reading those small sections, and gradually got through it. And it's one of those books that I'm just, like, so thankful that I put the time and effort into it, because it is one of my favorite books. Anna Karenina is still my favorite of Tolstoy's writings, but this is certainly up there. And the story, the Napoleonic War, the, like, ridiculously large cast of characters, the exploration of Russia during this time, Tolstoy's genius and the way that he can literally, like, talk about anything and everything in these books, and it's just brilliant. Like, it gave me such an appreciation for him as a writer. And because I read War and Peace, because I read Anna Karenina, I discovered Russian literature and Russian culture and history in a way that I don't think I would have otherwise. Because up until that point, Russia for me was like Anastasia and that whole legend there, and that was essentially it. But this made me realize how much more there was. And so by the time I went to college and took courses on Imperial Russia and started really diving into the cultural history of the revolution and the Russian intelligentsia and all of that stuff, I could draw, like, a direct line from the experience of reading Anna Karenina and War and Peace to me getting to that point in my own like academic career. But yeah, this moment in time, 15-year-old me being overly ambitious and trying to tackle this, it makes me laugh now because I remember like carrying this book with me to classes because I would like try to pick at it if I finished like an exam early or I had a free period, and my teachers thought I was crazy. I just remember people being wildly impressed by precocious me tackling this book at 15 when so many adults had not attempted it once in their life. But yeah, that's the story behind that and my love affair with Leo Tolstoy. Okay, the next book is a 2-volume collection of the collected plays of Tennessee Williams. And I know that's going to have a glare, so I'm just going to take one of these out, and arguably it's going to have a glare too. But as I think I've mentioned on this channel, my honors thesis in college was on Tennessee Williams, and my thesis was exploring Tennessee Williams as a female Gothic playwright. And I decided on that as a subject, didn't know where it would take me my junior year when I basically proposed my thesis and found a advisor for it. But the summer before I returned to school for my senior year, I spent the entire time reading this entire collection, reading every single play of Tennessee Williams, taking notes, underlining, trying to find connections to basically find the handful of plays that I really wanted to focus on and like explore more completely. And so that summer, this was essentially all I read. Like, I went from play to play to play, and I really had such a fantastic time with it. I mean, I already knew at that point that I loved Tennessee Williams. Like, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof is one of my favorite plays of all time. I've seen countless film adaptations of his plays. I've gone and actually seen stage productions of his plays. So I knew how much I loved him, but it was in reading his entire like collection that I really understood his genius. And that time, like preparing to write my thesis, I had so much fun. Like, I know that sounds dorky, it is dorky, but I loved the research element. I loved analyzing. I loved trying to find trends and connections and like motifs, and it was just, I wish I could go back to that time because it was really proving to myself that I could write this like bigger piece. My thesis ended up being like 65 pages long. It was the labor of basically a year of reading, writing, editing to get it to that point, and it all started that summer when I went through all of his plays. And so the collection, each volume basically is broken into certain years. So this one is 1957 to 1980, and the first one is actually from 1937 to 1955. But yeah, like nerdy Brittany with her academic leanings, take me back to that summer. Take me back. And the final book, which I know was in a video this month already, or might be in one that's coming up after this, is Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient, which I'm going to sound like a broken record. This is a book that is one of my favorites of all time, and I've spoken about what it's about countless times, but it is World War II literary fiction, and I love it. simply put. But the first time I actually read it was February of 2020. And the reason this is kind of stuck in my mind is because I read this book entirely on the train commute into the city for work. So my train ride was an hour into the city, an hour back, so I did a lot of reading that way, similar to how I read on the bus for school, and this was a book that I read on that commute. I would sit by the window, put in my earbuds, listen to some sort of like instrumental music, and just read. And this would be one of the last books that I would read having that experience, because by mid-March, I was working from home, the world was experiencing a pandemic, and like time just froze. We were all stuck at home. So yeah, this book just takes me back to that time when I know personally that I was hearing about COVID as it pertained to the outbreak in China, because I listened to a lot of like BBC World News, so I knew about that. But at this time in February, like, the rest of the world, we weren't really worried about it. We were talking about what was happening in China with the outbreak and what, like, that sort of thing, but we had no idea. Like, we had no clue, and I don't remember being worried at that time, because basically everything that I remember hearing was that it was basically the flu, like, it's not a big deal. But at the time I was reading it, completely clueless. But yeah, so this takes me back to those last few weeks of ignorance when it came to the pandemic and life changing, but I just remember those quiet, like, hours on the train reading this book, falling in love with it, ugly sobbing on the train, which I'm sure the people that sat in the quiet car were accustomed to because I did it regularly enough, but like ugly sobbing as I read parts of this book, it becoming one of my favorites, me literally posting a picture on my IG stories from my personal account talking about how did it take me so long to like get to this book. But yeah, it just takes me back to that particular point in time last year. So yeah, those are the 10 books and my long-winded stories about the time and place in which I read them and why they have some sort of meaning to me. I think in a lot of cases, these books have had like some almost like transformative impact on my life and my story, which I know sounds really like woo and I'm crazy, but it's true. A lot of these books have had a lasting like impact on my life and the person that I've become. So yeah, I am grateful for having read every single one of them and for the memories that are attached to them, even the less happy ones. And so now is when I tag people, and I would actually really like to tag Olive at a book Olive. I don't think you do that many tags from what I've seen of your videos, but I would be very curious to see your answers to this one. Also want to tag Margaret over at Margaret Pinard, Katie from over at Katie Reads&Rants, Emma from Overstuffed Shelf, Noelle from Noelle 7 Pages, and let's go with Emma from A Cup of Books. So tagging quite a few people here, but I would love to see their answers, and if anyone else wants to do this tag, you can say that I tagged you too. But with that, I'm going to end this video. I do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye!